So I'm not currently sharing my screen. I'm not presenting a screen at all at the moment. I tried to present my entire screen. I tried to present a window. Yeah, that's what I'm doing. I'm going my entire screen. Okay, I've got two. I'm operating on two screens. So I'm going to try this one. All right. I'm presenting my screen. And we've basically just gone into a weird, all right, cool. Let's just start. Yeah, I'm just going to stop that. All right, cool. It's presenting a screen within a screen. So I'm just going to present my entire screen. Okay, so if I share this screen, at the moment, all right, at the moment on this screen, you are looking at my desktop. So I am now going to full screen my presentation. Does it take over your entire screen? Can you still see your faces, the little video with your faces on the top right hand side? Oh, bugger. All right, I'm not sure why it's doing that. Maybe it's something at your end. Maybe something at your end. I don't need to see you. Exactly right. So it's just this thing that we just need to get rid of. Yep. Yep. On a video screen, Yep. 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 It says nothing. I can't remove this presentation. It doesn't give me any rights. I can't pin it. hang on. Unpin your presentation from your main screen. What does that mean? Okay. That's it. That's all I can't do. I can't remove the presentation. I can't turn off the mic here. Yeah, I can't remove anything. So all right, so I'll unpresent. And I'll just present again. And I'm going to share my entire screen. Okay. Yep. So you should see I'm moving this. I'm moving the so it's interesting that I can't get rid of that, can I? Oh. Okay. I can't. Oh wait, I can remove this tile. All right. So is it quite small now? What about now? Still normal size? So that's a little tile with a venture photography old logo on it, isn't it? Yeah. Okay. I just moved my mouse over it and basically just went remove. Basically just went like, like remove it basically. I just when it says show in a tile, I go and remove tile, and I went minimize it. So, but it's obviously not showing that on your screen, is it? So, I'm not sure. Have you had a similar problem with other presenters at your club with who are basically coming into Google Meet? Right. Okay, I see. Okay, and the first then. Well, learning experience for you all. Okay, cool. I'm just going to pop up my. I'm still sending a video to others in the meeting. Yep, so you can see me there, I think, in a little small window. Yeah, that's cool. All right. Hopefully that's what I look like, everyone. In case you're wondering why this embodied voice is speaking out electronically to you. I'll leave this hanging around a little bit just so that you can see what I'm like. Thanks very much, Ian, for the invitation to, or rather the request to give a presentation. I gave Ian several options in terms of topics, and I think we kind of mutually just went with this topic of portrait photography. Is Diane Kelsey there? I'm ready to begin. So you guys just let me know what's what.
Can you hear me saying? No?
Yes, I can hear you.
Oh, good. Thanks. All right. Obviously, you realise, everybody, tonight that we've got a speaker from Perth, Mr. Seng Mah, whom I met about 6 or 7 years ago when I first picked up my camera and decided to look deeper into photography as a hobby. Seng is a professional photographer and educator in Perth since about 2009. He runs venture photography workshops and tours out of these studios in Fremantle. Worth having a look if you're ever in Perth. He's got quite a comprehensive program that he runs for local workshops and overseas trips if you ever want to join in. Over the years, I've had the pleasure of attending many events, workshops, street walks, etc., run by Seng. Always well organised, full of practical tips, and we always learn a lot. Seng has a great sense of humour, a lot of energy, meaning basically that we all enjoy ourselves greatly. He's a good laugh and has the patience of a saint. If you don't understand anything, he has many ways of teaching. Always well organised, full of practical I've travelled overseas with Seng and another photographer, Lynn Gale, who's an accomplished a lot of energy, travel photographer and journalist as well. Basically that Seng has an extensive background in teaching and mentoring, as well as being an all-round nice guy. Excellent photographer. He's also a mad cat lover, which I've travelled overseas with Seng, and another very generous with his time. He's freely supportive of the WA travel photography journalist by way of judging and demonstrating. Seng has an extensive background, always keen to mentor and share all his knowledge, being an all-round nice guy. Excellent photographer. He's also in many community-based photographic events in WA, as well as very generous arts canteen and the renowned Fremantle International Portrait Prize, just to name a few. He's also a very much sought-after photography judge and recently was awarded the President's for Excellence in Photographic Judging events in WA. Seng has also won multiple awards as well as photography in the professional and creative arts scenes. The renowned Fremantle International being placed WA Photographer of the Year in 2018. He's also very much a documentary photography judge and finalist in the WA Travel Photography of the Year 2017, 18 and 19. Seng has also won multiple awards, a lot to achieve there. Anyway, that's probably enough from me, Seng. So I hope everybody enjoys themselves. I can't wait. Sorry you can't see me. I'll have to phone you separately. Bye. And finalist in WA travel photography.
Okay, so thanks very much for that rep. I should get you to write me my bio next time. I'll just send it to all the other camera shots and I've done through a presentation. I'm going to turn off my audio now and just basically just
So I hope everybody enjoys themselves. I can't
with
wait.
the presentation.
Sorry you can't
So
see
because
me.
I can't see you, I'm
To
basically
phone
just
you
going to talk.
separately.
And what we might do is maybe about halfway through, I'll call a little pause and whether there are any questions. But before I begin, Ian or Andrew, how long have you scheduled I'm going to turn off my audio now and just basically just
So I hope everybody enjoys themselves. I can't
with
wait.
the presentation.
Sorry you can't
So
see
because
me.
I can't see you,
What time does everyone need to go home by?
what we might do is maybe about halfway through, I'll call a little
About an
pause
hour.
and
About an hour.
whether there
Okay,
are any
I'll try and be
questions.
quick.
But before I begin, Ian or
All right, here
Andrew,
we.
how long have you
I'll
scheduled?
try and be quick.
So all good there. I am going to turn off my video.
Enjoys themselves. I can't wait.
And I'm just going to be so because I can't see you.
What time does everyone need to go home by?
What we might do. Okay. So I'm a portrait photographer and I'm also a
About
landscape
an hour.
photographer and I do
About
documentary
an hour.
photography
Okay, I'll
and
try
I
and be
do.
quick.
But before I begin, travel photography. I do a lot
All
of
right,
different
here
kinds
we.
of photography. The only two
I'll try and be quick.
I suppose genres of photography that never appealed to me is or are macro.
What time does everyone need to go
I'm
home
sure there are a
by?
lot of macro fans. Okay, so
in your
I'm a
in your
portrait
club
photographer
and
and
also
society.
about an hour.
Macro doesn't
About an hour. Okay, I'll try and do.
photographer. For personal, I do a lot of different types of we all different photographers. And I suppose genres of I struggle with photography because I can't get excited about photographing, but again that's just a personal choice. But I photograph
What time does everyone
I'm
need to
sure
go
I'm
home
sure there
by?
are a lot of macro. One of my key passions in photography is portraiture. And it's I suppose I should qualify that by saying it's more creative portraiture for personal, where I can tell a story through I suppose photographing. I struggle with photography rather than just basically doing things like corporate portraiture. I'm sure there are a lot of one of my key passions in photography is portrait. Do those and it's I suppose I should qualify that by saying it's more portrait. I suppose what they call fine photography, where you're crafting something that is creative and artistic and has a story kind of rather than just basically in your portraiture. So that's what I wanted to talk about. One of my key passions in photography is to do those. And it's I suppose I should qualify that part of. I quite often get people asking me what is a portrait, and in this particular presentation, I'm just defining it as a photograph of a person because you can have a portrait of a dog, for example, or a cat, or so on and so forth. It's a depiction of something which shows his personality or his character, and say that obviously animals have personalities and characters, or at least we ascribe personality or character to the animal itself. But for the purposes of this particular session, I'm going to define a portrait as a photograph of a person. A portrait describes who they are as individuals, so we get a glimpse, I guess, of them as a person. Or if we are kind of setting up a narrative portrait where we are kind of making a make-believe scenario, then basically the portrait tells us something about the character that a person is playing or representing in the way in which an actor would play a character in a movie. So when we do a portrait of a character, we're basically trying to encapsulate the character of the person that the portrait sitter is portraying or representing. A portrait can usually tell us about tell us something about their life, their relationships, experiences, their dreams. And at the end of the day, I think a portrait is about a story about a person. And I quite often tell people to look back through the sorts of powerful portraits that you may have come across in your early explorations in photography. I find that photographers quite often, when they are first starting out, they look at a much wider range of images than when they are established. Because when you're first starting out, you're very curious about the medium of photography, and if you're interested in portraiture, then you're very interested in the category or genre of portraiture. So you want to explore. You feel that you feel a need to explore, and by exploring, you're actually looking at a whole range of different portraits. taken by photographers in the past. And in doing so, you're exposing yourself to a wider way of seeing the representation of people than you would if you're an established photographer. Because once you're established, you tend to kind of look at portraits that you're interested in because you've already formulated a direction for your portraiture or for your photography. So I often find the early stages of someone learning portraiture to be incredibly or a tone that resonates with them and that they would like to adopt and then work through in that process. So what I've done just then is I've run through a number of portraits, from Dorothea Lange's migrant mother all the way down to the very controversial Annie Leibovitz's portrait of Miley Cyrus when Miley was still quite young. Just to give you a fair idea of the incredible breadth and variety in portraiture, in representation of a person. So let's start by basically going with my curiosity about portraiture and what portraiture means for me, and I hope what portraiture will mean for you if you're interested in this particular genre of photography. I think a portrait photographer needs to be someone who is incurably curious about people and their lives. Whether it's people watching or whether it's actually, when you're speaking to someone, asking them a myriad of questions to kind of plumb the depths of their past, their background, their stories, their lives, and so on and so forth. And I think it's this curiosity that actually makes us very successful portrait photographers, simply because the curiosity drives us to want to connect with people and to learn more about them and to engage with them, and to feel this love of wanting to actually create a picture, an image or a representation of someone or of a particular character. So if you have got a curiosity about people in your lives, disregard the fact that people might call you a sticky beak or a busybody. It's a very important and significant trait to actually cultivate, and please continue to cultivate and foster it because it can drive you to become a better portrait photographer. As portrait photographers, we also create stories, whether the stories are, I suppose, stories of a real person's life and experiences, where they were, where they are now, where they're going, or whether we are actually creating made-up stories, fiction, and in a way recruiting people, what we normally call models, to be part of that storytelling or that narrative crafting in that particular process. I'm not saying that one is more authentic than the other. For me, they are both equally valid. And we can derive a lot of pleasure and joy from creating portraits in both settings, whether we are creating fictitious stories or whether we are, in a way, using a portrait of a real person to tell stories about who they are in their lives and so on and so forth. So for me, all portraiture is some kind of storytelling, which means that the need to craft the story, the need to create the image so that it tells the story is the driving force behind the way in which the portrait is put together. From the image capture stage, from when you press the shutter button to the editing or post-production stage to the final presentation of the portrait, whether it's digital or in print. It's also important to understand here that when we're talking about storytelling, even though the photographer is quite often the person who is directing, so to speak, the shoot, and perhaps communicating with the person that they are photographing, it's important to actually acknowledge and to understand that a portrait is a collaborative storytelling experience between at least two people. You've got the photographer, and then you've got the subject. Um, some people actually say that there is actually a third party involved as well. And this is actually true. And the third party is the viewer, the person who will eventually look at the image or consume the image or react to the image is also party to the storytelling itself. So it's important to understand that a portrait isn't about you calling the shots as a photographer. You may be expected to call the shots. You may be entering the shoot with an idea in mind, but you have to obtain the buy-in from the people you are photographing. Whether you're actually taking a photograph of a real person and their real lives, or whether you're actually, involving actors and talents and models in crafting a particular story. Either way, you have to obtain that buy-in. So even if you're taking a photograph which appears to be a quick street portrait. So, for example, this one, where I was in Kolkata in 2022, and we were in a place called Niman Bothgat, and just walking around the streets. And they are very interesting people, obviously all over the place. And part of me as a photographer is kind of doing documentary slash street photography, but there's always that drive where I want to take portraits of people, but I don't want to take portraits of people without their consent, because that's the documentary part of it. When you're just documenting life on the streets and all that kind of stuff, that's documentary. I want to get some level of engagement, and to do from the person, and in order to do that, I need to always get an element of consent from that person. And consent is interesting because for me it's either overt or it's implied. So an overt consent would be, an example would be, you go up to someone on the street and say, hey, I really like the hat you're wearing and the light's really good on you. Can I take a portrait of you? And they say, yes, of course. And they stand there posing for you and you take a few frames. So that's obviously incredibly overt consent. But then there's the kind of implied consent where, especially if you're working in a context where the person that you're photographing doesn't speak the same language or there's a cultural difference and all that, then quite often the consent can be implied through the way in which you engage with the person prior to actually taking the photo. And quite often it's about making that eye contact, making that personal contact as well, and maybe spending a little bit of time in a lead up to taking the photograph, forming that connection, even if you don't share a common language. So, for example, I want to tell a story about this man. I don't know him. I don't speak his language. Uh, I have a feeling that I know what he's doing in that context, but it may be completely incorrect. I don't have that kind of information with me. But the light is beautiful. He is incredibly attractive as a person who I wanted to photograph. Um, and also, he was doing something. I like photographing people who are doing something. In this case, he's sitting down on a little cart, which is outside of the frame, and smoking a little cigarette, and he's doing something. And then the light was great. So I wanted to take a portrait. I was driven by the need to take this kind of a close-up environmental portrait. And so I had to actually obtain consent. And the consent was completely implied by basically me being very visible as a photographer, taking a very wide street shot where he was just a part of a bigger street shot, making eye contact with him, raising my hand at him, going up towards him, holding the camera up, and then asking very slowly but in English, can I take your picture? Which he probably doesn't understand what it means, but the gesture, the voice, the eye contact, holding the camera up, and also, I guess, kind of exuding positive vibes can often make that connection and give you that implied consent that you then take the photograph. And you can see here it's actually making eye contact with these beautifully large brown eyes looking directly at me. And there's that moment of connection with me, or the act of my photography that actually comes to the fore there. And it's that point of connection that is really important. So when I take portraits, I'm basically firing away about 2 or 3 frames. I don't, I know that, I've done it so long that I know when that moment's going to happen. But even then, I'll still take it when that moment happens, but take a few more after the moment has happened, because you never know. A moment never finishes. A moment could keep building to point, and then it will finish. So I just make sure that as I see the moment happening, that eye contact, that engagement happening, I'll shoot, and then I'll just keep shooting the few frames, because you're shooting at about, let's say, 250th of a second. It doesn't take that long to fire away 2 or 3 frames, but each one is 250th of a second. So you just go bang, 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 bang. And you can often see the moment kind of crescendo, and then you know when you've lost it. It's a gut feeling that you have where maybe the eye looks away slightly, and you know that connection has been broken and you can't recover the connection. You're shooting at about, let's say, 200. So let's talk about storytelling then. Stories begin with an idea. The high-floating way in which photographers and creative people like you call the idea is the vision. You have a vision that you want to bring into fulfillment, which means that every portrait, if you think about it, if you're driven by a vision, if you're driven by an idea, then every portrait you create needs to be shot with an intent to create this vision. And it's very important, I think, for photographers of all types, to always shoot with intent. I think that differentiates a strong image from a snapshot. A snapshot may not necessarily have been shot with intent. A snapshot is quite often just a gut reaction to something that's happening there and saying, oh, this might make a good picture, snap, but there is very little intent driving it apart from the need to capture the subject. Whereas the idea of intent here is that you have an idea, you have a vision that you want to actually create. You have an idea, a picture that you want to create, and you're pursuing that with intent. And it's important to actually know what this vision is. So even if you're doing a street portrait, there is intent there, because even though the moment of walking around the streets, looking at people and suddenly wanting to take their portrait because of the following, A, B, C, D elements and all that, that is still the intent, the vision that you're trying to create there. So once you've got vision, then your vision becomes basically the spirit, the soul, or the heart of the portrait that you want to create. So for me, it's about, okay, I've got this vision I want, but how do I want this image to impact on the person looking at it? And so now we're bringing that third party that I referred to earlier on. So it's not just a photographer, it's not just the subject or the subjects, but now we're talking about the viewer. So what is the message or the idea or the feeling in the portrait that I'm trying to create so that it has this particular impact on the viewer? So it's actually a series of questions you need to ask yourself. What's my vision? How do I shoot it to actually achieve my vision? And how will my vision affect someone looking at that portrait that I'm trying to create? So when we're talking about vision, it's really about coming up with, I guess, a visual or a concept in your head. So how do you create this whole notion of mood and feeling in your portrait? So you could look at it in terms of how you're lighting it. Is it going to be a tonally dark, low-key portrait? Or is it going to be a bright portrait, a high-key portrait? How are you going to use your light to achieve these tones or to evoke a particular mood, for example? How are you going to use color if your portrait's going to be in color? Is it going to be bright, and colorful, and vibrant, and vivid? Or are things going to look a little bit less vibrant? Or are they going to look a little bit more muted in terms of the colors that come through? How will you frame and compose your portrait, the portrait that you're actually creating? And what is it going to be bright, colorful? How's the subject going to present themselves? What are they going to? What expression is going to be on their face? What are they going to do with their eyes? Are they making eye contact with the viewer? How are they posed? What's their body language communicating? What kind of clothing are they going to wear, or are they not going to wear clothing? And why is that significant to the the vision that you've got for that particular portrait. So you need to ask yourself these questions if they're basically going to shoot and create a portrait with intent, that sense there. So what I'm going to show you next are just a series of different portraits I've shot in the past, going back quite a number of years and some perhaps quite recent, just to show you the diversity that can emerge when you're photographing portraits in natural light or using off-camera lighting or in a studio or whatever. In the past, going back quite a number of years and some. So this is you probably have this in New Zealand as well, but there are people who wake up very early in the morning and in the extremely cold and frigid temperatures of winter, they go swimming at the beach. We call them polar bears here. I'm sure you've got your equivalents there. And here are two polar bears at the beach near Fremantle called Port Beach. I know the guy. I think he's done a few courses with me, and he says, "Come and photograph us for me." Maddeningly go swimming in the morning at Port Beach in winter. So I went over there, and they were just walking along the beach, and I just stopped them for a moment and said, "Hey, let's just get this quick portrait in natural light, fully natural light, in a nice, relaxed environment, an environment in which they are very familiar with, and you can tell that there's a sense of relaxation over there. Even though they are kind of posing, they're not being overly posy. They're just kind of very casual, just caught in that particular moment. And then here are two very different portraits. Left-hand side is shot in the studio with quite extensive post-production put into it. Again, to create a story about this particular character that this guy is playing. He's really into medieval Viking kind of stuff, so he dressed up that way. And the picture on the right-hand side was actually taken with an iPhone 6. So it's not as sharp, obviously. It has a Polaroid-y kind of a feel to it, and it's just a friend of mine, Michelle, with her dog, Coco, in an art gallery in Fremantle. And that was just the light. I just saw the light coming in from the window and says, "Oh, Michelle, go and stand over there with Coco. Look at the light." And the dog also looked at the light. And I took a shot with my iPhone because I didn't have any other camera with me. This is a sort of like a street portrait of a man in Bali, Indonesia, who's breeding in an art gallery in roosters. So they have the I don't know what they're called now, rooster fights or cockerel fights or something along the lines of that. It was just a very casual portrait. Walking down, saw what he was doing. He was out there in his backyard with the roosters. Just a really quick connection, and then took a portrait. Another slightly different approach to portraiture. This is from a project where I was photographing people with tattoos in very, very contrasty lights in a studio environment. It was just a very casual portrait. This is a couple, family I used to know years and years and years ago. They were very alternative. I visited them in their home and just had a chat about photography and stuff like that. And they said, "Well, why don't we do a shoot in the laundry?" Because, well, we looked around the kitchen and all that and was like, the laundry has the best light. So we just photographed it in the laundry. And I really just wanted to kind of, I guess, show the connection between the husband and wife, and then the child, the son and dad. These are two post portraits. One on the left-hand side is taken at a sailor's bar in Fremantle. So it's actually a bar that you just start to make it look as if it's a long ago kind of bar at the wharves or the docks. And then the one on the right-hand side was from an off-camera lighting workshop that I had run a couple of years ago, using Canon off-camera lighting. Again, just a variety of different sort of portraits. A very set-up shot in Indonesia at the Tukatundu waterfalls. A homage to Frederick McCubbin's Down on His Luck. So what I really want to show there is the fact that each and every one of these things had an idea behind them. We're trying to create a feeling, so you light, position, direct, to achieve that particular effect itself. And in order to achieve that effect, you've got to collaborate. So the key here is you've got to collaborate with the people that you're photographing. I sometimes have people come to me and they say, "I love portraiture." And I go, "That's great. What kind of portraiture do you like?" And they go, "I like the one where I'm basically hanging around the corner in the street and photographing people with a 150 to 600 mil lens without them knowing." And then I have to bite my tongue because I'm thinking to myself, Well, A, that feels a little bit creepy, but B, not being judgmental, but B, that's not really portraiture. That's a documentary approach to photographing people's faces and capturing them unawares. Whereas for me, a portrait is about this person or this particular character. So, in order to get someone to collaborate with you, you've got to get them to buy into it. So the key to get them to buy into it is that you need to be able to communicate with them. And I think communication is a word that a lot of people are terrified of. I remember when I was much, much younger, and I'm sure a lot of you will probably relate to this. When you're applying for your first job, and one of the criteria is that you've got to show that you have got solid, strong, or good communication skills. Then you sit there and you go, well, how do I actually articulate in this application for a job that I've got good communication skills, right? When you're applying for your first job. So, in order to basically have effective collaboration with the person you're photographing, you need to be able to have good communication skills. So you have to address that in the same way in which you're addressing that job application years and years and years ago, decades ago, when you're putting that in. So how do you demonstrate that you've got good communication skills? How do you show that you've got good communication skills? How do you talk to people? How do you engage with people with your good communication skills? So for me, in portraiture, this is the guts of the communication itself. It's about involving them in the vision that you're trying to create. Tell them what it is. Hey, I've got this idea. I'd like to photograph you doing this. What do you think? Do you want to add something else to it? Or, hey, let's do a photo shoot together. Is there something about yourself that you'd love me to present in this photograph of you? How do you think we should do it? You can also give them emotional cues. Most people, when you've got a camera trained at them, they basically revert to what it is that they've learned since they're a child. Stand there, smile, look straight into the lens, and hold that pose for at least 2 seconds, just in case the photographer needs a bit of time to focus and take the shot and compose and all that. Then you just get a very flat image, flat portrait. So what you want to do is you want to give them emotional cues as part of the storytelling process. Now, you can direct them if they're representing a particular character or personality. You can say things like, look as if you just won lotto, or look as if you've just discovered a whole tub of chocolate ice cream in the freezer and there's no one at home. Those kinds of emotional cues you can give them. Or if you're photographing someone who's playing a character, you can be a little bit more creative with the emotional cues that you can provide them. Imagine that, tell them. Imagine that such a thing has happened. How does this person respond to it? How would they feel? Fill your head with those feelings and just let your face show those emotions. So I never tell people when I'm photographing them to look grumpy or to look angry, because everyone reverts to a caricaturish representation of what grumpiness or anger or whatever looks. I don't tell people to look proud, because they in your head will have this image of what looks proud, and they'll just think that that's what you want to do. What you want them to do is give them the feeling that can drive that that kind of expression in your face, that can drive the way in which they're holding themselves, body language wise. So you tell them, imagine that if they're playing a character, or do you remember when, if they are actually a person who's in a way representing themselves in the portrait. The other thing that's important to also do is to set up what I call pre-shoot antecedents or antecedents to get them in the right frame of mind. So the word antecedents here or antecedents here comes, I use them because I come from a teaching background years and years ago. And for those of you who, I know I can't see you and you can't kind of react to me, but I'm just going to say, if you've come from a background where you've ever taught children in primary school or secondary school, one of the things that they train you as a teacher is to actually look at the classroom antecedents. In other words, are there things within the physical environment of the classroom or where you're doing the training that could trigger distraction, that can trigger disruptive behavior and stuff like that? And if so, remove them. So the same thing applies when you're actually photographing a portrait. If there are elements that are going to distract the person that you're photographing from thinking and feeling and behaving in a way that is able to create this collaborative vision, then you need to remove them. So the most basic example is children and electronic devices. If you remove electronic devices from where you're going to be photographing children or young people, tell their parents, don't let them bring, you're not bringing your iPads, you're not bringing their phones and all that. They're coming completely unplugged. Then you're immediately removing the distraction of them wanting to spend time with those devices when you're actually photographing them. If you're photographing someone and you want to photograph them, but they've brought their partner in, ask the partner politely to go and do something else because the partner is the distraction for that person. And the partner will be a distraction for you as well because they'll be kind of looking over your shoulder and you'll have to kind of be kind of aware of them when what you really need to do is actually put 110% of your effort and your attention on the person that you're photographing. So try and remove as many pre-shoot antecedents as possible. And the third one is tied in with the communication thing I mentioned earlier, which is to talk them through the shoot. Talk to your portrait sitters throughout the shoot. So I'm not saying that you have to basically blab on all the time. Obviously you don't. But as you make changes to the way you're directing them or so on and so forth, talk to them. Ask them how comfortable they are with this. Is this going to be okay? Do you feel okay showing this part of yourself? Are you okay? Because is this idea I've got, it requires you to maybe just be a bit honest and vulnerable about yourself. Are you okay with that? Just keep talking them through that whole process because as part of that conversation, you also learn more about them as a person as well. So again, just a few more images. Just look at the sorts of different communication and collaboration prompts that can come through. So this is Bree, and we just did because she's an incredibly tattooed person, and she also feels very deeply and strongly about certain things, and has had, even though she's quite young, has had a lot of life experiences, both good and bad, in quite a short time. So we did this shoot in a hotel. She wanted to do a boudoir thing, and I said, well, I'll do a boudoir thing, but I want it to be not boudoir-y boudoir. That kind of makes sense. I want it to be more like the character-driven boudoir, if that kind of makes sense. But you'll see that she appears a few times in this presentation. You see what I mean by that. So one of the first shoots I did there was at a window. The good thing about hotel rooms, they've got these massive drapes and curtains that you can pull open and you can pull shut. So you can actually control the amount of lighting spilling through those curtains. And I thought, I wanted to take a photograph of her just had the curtains, but I just didn't want it to look glamorous and boudoir-y as a lot of those boudoir things do. I said, Bree, do you mind if we construct a story about this? And I talked to her about the story, and I said, look, your boyfriend has taken you out. He's wine and dined you, brought you to this wonderful hotel. You've had a wonderful night, etc., etc. You wake up in the morning and you're brimming with love for this man who's just shown you such an amazing time. And then he gets up and in a very serious face tells you that he's breaking up with you because he's seen someone else. And so without even waiting for a reply, he turns and leaves the room. The car's parked outside the window about 2 stories down. So you run to the window and you look up and you see him drive away. Now look back at me and show me the expression on your face. And that's what was created from that. So that was where you tell the story to lead that prompt. So you'll notice that in that particular direction, I don't mention. So this is a made-up story, obviously. I mean, but in that moment, I was pulling her into this soap opera-ish kind of drama, which was laden with emotion. She was buying into the story. I was almost being like a storyteller, telling the story. I never in any time say you feel sad, you're feeling depressed. I don't tell them what emotional cues to evoke. I just tell them the story and then say, show me what you're feeling in your face, with your face. And then they do that naturally. And it's a lot more powerful than you actually prescribing what they are supposed to feel. You tell them the story. They feel what it is that they need to feel. You're involving in the story because they're creating this scenario that they're almost role playing in their mind. This is another one. It's a fun shoot I did in the studio with my friend Justin and his 3 sons, and we just decided to do a really funny one. And I said, look, you just stand against the wall there, put your arms across your chest and stuff like that. And then I just get them a cue and say, guys, just look at your dad as if he's the biggest dog ever. And then bang, that kind of created that immediate cue there. So I don't say, don't smile and all that. I don't tell them what to do. I just basically say, do this as if such and such. This is a portrait that I took of this gentleman whose name I've forgotten. I think it's Graham, from one of the local camera clubs in Perth. They invited me to, again, talk about portraiture and lighting. And one of the things they wanted to do at the end of it was to actually do like a lighting shoot. So I had to demonstrate a lighting shoot. So I brought some props, so the jacket, the scarf, the old camera, the cap, and everything else. And I looked around, and there was Graham, and he had this silvery hair and silvery beard and all that. And I said, oh, can you come and model for me? And he was like, oh, okay. And he stepped up there, and I dressed him up. And I think everyone was having a good laugh because it was just so, out of the ordinary. I gave him that little camera, and he held it, and I says, okay, I'm going to take a picture of you. And he was like, oh, okay. Then he just stood there looking all very nervous and stiff. And I said, okay. I'm just kind of looking at his vintage, and I thought to myself, okay, so imagine that you're on holiday in Italy, and it's, when you're younger, and that's how people dress back in the olden days, and you've got this old-fashioned camera, and you're standing on a pier somewhere, lovely in the Italian Riviera, and you turn around, and there is Sophia Loren, looking absolutely gorgeous. And she looks around and she makes eye contact with you, and she smiles. And now you've got to non-verbally use only your eye contact and facial expression. Tell her that you want to take a picture of her, and that's what he pulled. So the direction there is purely just to get him into the frame of mind and to kind of get that response to it. This is actually a real couple, husband and wife. I think they're husband and wife. They could be non-married husbands and wives, partners, life partners. And it was just basically out in a small place called Balingup, a small rural area called Balingup, about 3 hours south of Perth in WA. And it was just lovely kind of light late in the afternoon. And they're very loved up. They both like that vintage kind of costuming or clothing. They wear it every day, basically. It's not even a costume for them. They just wear that every day. And rockabilly, I think it's called. And I just said, look, you guys look really loved up. So just get really, really loved up. Hug each other. You're all over each other, arms around each other, and just basically just go and just shot like this. And, you don't even have to tell them to laugh because suddenly it's just like, oh, yeah, we're really loved up. This is what we're going to do. And then they basically just run with their own honest emotions with that. So what I like to do is actually tap into existing emotions. So if someone's excited, I want to tap into that emotion of excitement and make them even more excited. And if someone's happy, I want to do that and make them even more happy. So I want to tap into like existing emotions, even if it's something that's sort of made up or fictitious in that sense there. So these are real portraits. So this is a boy called Peter from the Yolngu homeland of Ninyike up in East Arnhem Land. And we were there doing a tour up in East Arnhem Land, and we spent some time in the Yolngu homelands there. And Peter was really excited to be showing us the mud flats around the beach and the mud flats around where he lives. And he finds these $10 shells that you can crack open, and in the center of it, there are these little star-shaped bits that you can then put on your ears. And he put it on his ears, and I was like really excited to show me. I took the photograph, and he just gave me this really kind of genuine kind of look to it. And then he had a friend, Henry, and a dog called Big Dog, and they just love being photographed. So I just went like, okay, you love being photographed. I want to take pictures, so let's go. And basically just tapped into all the excitement, and everything that they did with the dogs and everything else was pretty much undirected. They just came up with these concepts, and all I did was choose the angle, choose the composition, choose the lighting, and then basically goes with it, So these are incredibly real sorts of reactions, I suppose. Here are two images. They're portraits taken in various places in India. And these images are taken after they have posed. So quite often when you're traveling, I find that what happens is people will quite happily pose for you, especially in countries like India and Nepal and all that. But it gets very, very kind of like very, very staid type posing. They'll put it there, like the guy on the left was twirling his mustache, and both of these were taken when I was running tours in India, and people were like, snappity, snappity, snap, and I'm going like, oh, that's good. Then I was just basically waiting for them to just pass that moment when no one was taking photos of them anymore. They were still engaging, and that was when you end up having that real connection come through rather than the posed up kind of connections. So let's take a bit of a change here, and let's talk about the tools of the trade for portrait photographers. And here they are. So it's light, depth of field, framing, pose, and engagement. Just 5 out of many, many, many other tools available out there. I think a lot of people get confused when people talk about tools of the trade for portrait photographers because they think suddenly it's an 85mm f1.2L lens. But that's not. That's just a lens. It's not a portrait tool. It's a lens that can be used to take portraits. But the tools that craft great portraits are at least these 5 elements here. So let's talk a little bit about light, what we can do with light. So if you're familiar with other people talking about light and so on and so forth, you know that really there's a whole range of different types of light. There is soft light, which comes from very large light sources like windows and putting someone close to a window. Soft light wraps around the person. If it's talking about the face, it wraps around the face. So it lights the part of the face that's facing the light, and it wraps around and almost goes around the part of the face that is away from the light. Large light sources, large light sources create soft lighting, and soft lighting simply means that that transition from light to shadow is very gradual. It's a very feathery kind of transition, and quite often you don't even get dark shadows coming through because the light wraps around the person. And then you get hard lighting, where there's a very clear delineation between what is lit and what is not lit. So the shadows have hard edges to them, hard outlines to the shadows. So they come from small light sources, such as the sun. This picture is taken in direct sunlight. The sun was quite low and angled down, but it was still a blue sky, clear afternoon, so the light is very hard. And it's very high contrast. You get very, very deep shadows. You can have diffused shade lighting to create soft light, like in this, photographing the shade on an incredibly overcast day. Or you can use direct sunlight for the hard kind of, I suppose, fairly modernish kind of look to it. Light comes from a particular direction, so you can use directional lighting, such as these examples here. And you can deploy different quantities of light in a portrait. So I've put 5 images here to show you how you can light the same face differently by deploying how much of that face is actually lit. And depending on how much of that face is actually lit, you create a very different mood. The way this is done basically is I've got the guy Kieran, and I've actually got an LED light, quite a large, what, 45 centimeter diameter LED light, kind of roughly almost facing him, but 3/4 towards him and slightly above his head there. So in the first picture, most of his face is lit. You can see that. And then what I then do is I start taking the images by moving away from the light towards the shadowy part of it, so that I'm basically photographing the shadowy part of his face, photographing from the shadows. And as I move more and more to my right, you can see what's happening is I'm seeing less and less of his face, because his face is only being lit by that light from one direction. And you can see then when you look at the last image and you look at the first image, just the amount of light on the subject in those images changes the mood of that portrait. So you can actually shape with light. You can actually create mood and in a way sculpt the form, what they call chiaroscuro, light and shadows, light arising out of shadows, by shaping that light. In the most simple way of doing it, you can use a window. So here is Brie again, and that's the window. So you can pull the draped shut to basically funnel light through an opening, creating directional lighting. Then you just position the person within that light itself. You can make the window light very, very narrow, so it's a very narrow wedge of light coming through and create very dramatic portraits that way. You can choose to shoot from where the light is or from where the shadow is and create very different looks to the same person. So in the case of Jason here, this is like a studio demo that I was doing. The light is, again, roughly 45 degrees, a bit higher up to where he's facing. So it's lighting most of his face. In the picture on the left-hand side, I'm positioning myself where the light is. So I'm shooting from the light, and you can see it opens up his face. Whereas the picture on the right-hand side, I'm shooting from the other side. I've moved to my right, and so shooting from the shadowy side, and it makes his face seem a little bit more triangular, a little bit more narrow, because we don't see the other part of the face that's hidden in the shadow itself. So classically, that's your broad lighting versus short lighting portrait patterns there. You can always match the lighting with the mood or the story that you want to tell. And here are just two examples. So the first one is a very simple light. One light just very high above a person there to try and create a kind of Hollywoody, glamorous feel to it. And then a picture on the right-hand side with a bodybuilder with clay all over his body, I suppose. It's lit by two long soft boxes positioned on the left and to his right to create those kind of strong, stark shadows and the kind of symmetrical pose that he's actually in. And then back to Brie again in the hotel room. Open the windows massively. Rather than closing the curtains in, pull the windows back. You get very, very large light source, diffusing the light through those windows, and that's the soft wraparound light that we're talking about. So even though there's light and shadow on her face, for example, and on her body, you can see that the shadows are not really dark because the light wraps right around. You can also use side lighting, light on the left and light on the right-hand side. This is, again, with the same LEDs to create a completely different look and feel to that. One of the things I like doing as well is to actually shoot in natural light, backlit. So the sun is behind and above the person and allow for some of that flaring into the lens to soften the image for effect. So here are two examples. And one of the really cool things to do is actually be really experimental with lighting. If you've got someone who looks fairly feral, then underlight them. Do the monster lighting, put the light below. In the case, this is a light coming from an iPad. It's not anything way too sophisticated. I think you can see that it's quite a grainy picture because I think I shot this about ISO 3200. So just playing around with different sorts of light sources, an iPad, an iPhone, something along the lines of that can work remarkably well as well. And the other thing is, I have a lot of people come to me and say, oh, how do I get rid of shadows in my portraits? And it confuses me to heck because I don't know why they want to get rid of shadows in your portraits. Because shadows allow us to see the form, the structure. Shadows can be used to create mood and drama. And yet there's this whole range of people who assiduously ask me how to remove shadows in a portrait. And I'm going like, well, why would you want to not have any shadows in your portraits? And they go, Well, isn't that the correct way of photographing portraits? And then I don't really know how to answer that because really there is no correct way of photographing portraits. I mean, you can photograph a portrait and you could look really horrible in the way that it's a badly photographed portrait. But that has got nothing to do with light and shadow. That's just to do with it being a badly photographed portrait. You could have a beautifully photographed portrait that has got nothing to do with light and shadow. It's just beautifully photographed and it's deployed light the way it needs to be deployed. Lighting is very important because basically you can have the same pose, you light it differently, you create two very different images. And that's why I say there is no correct way of lighting a portrait. There is the way in which you light in order to obtain the vision that you want. I'm going to go a little bit technical here and talk a little bit about light and exposure. It's very important, this, especially for those of you who are photographing in natural light. So if you look at these two pictures, what's the difference between the lighting in these two portraits? That's the difference. The subject and background in the picture on the left are evenly lit. So the background is lit by the same light as the subject, the person. No contrast between the subject and the background. Easy. It's even lighting. All right? The typical kind of lighting that you get if you just photograph someone out in a brightly lit environment. The portrait on the right-hand side, however, is contrasty light because the background is dark and the light on the subject makes her bright, but the background is a dark background, so it's high contrast. Now, if you are photographing in contrasty light versus even lighting, you've got to know how to use your metering modes on your camera. The difference between, say, evaluative metering, sometimes called matrix metering, sometimes called pattern metering, depending on the camera you use, and spot metering. So evaluative metering basically meters for the entire frame. It looks at the entire frame, the way in which it's lit. Spot metering looks at the light in one spot. So if you're photographing a portrait of a person and it's high contrast lighting, you want to make sure that you're using spot meter, because when you're using spot meter, you can meter for the light on the person's skin that's being lit by the light source and not blowing it up. What happens if you use evaluative metering in a high contrast portrait light? This is what happens. So if the lighting is nice and dark and it's high contrast, so light's on the subject but not on the background, and you use evaluative metering where the camera is looking at the entire scene, the camera will basically look at all the darks in the scene and say, well, that's dark, I need to brighten it. And so it brightens the dark, and what that does then is it essentially blows out the light on the person's skin or complexion. And that kind of ruins the portrait. So if you want to explore this further, then it's worthwhile understanding that you need to shoot in full manual exposure mode. So doing M on your mode dial on most cameras. You want to meter, well, you want to use spot metering, so set your exposure metering to spot. You want to meter for light on the skin that you want to set your exposure. Usually it's a bright part of the skin. And this is what you got to do. For people with very fair skin, like people, Scandinavian type skin, non-tan, very pale, you want to set your exposure to about +2/3 or +0.7, depending on how your camera interprets that. For people with darker skin, like dark olive skin or darker than that, you set it to -2/3 or -0.7 in order to meter for that skin. And the reason for this is because your camera's metering will often want to meter for 18% gray or middle gray, which most skin isn't at middle gray. Most skin tones are either brighter than middle gray or darker than middle gray. So you need to compensate for this. So you've got someone with fair skin, your camera will want to darken the skin, so that's why you overexpose to +2/3. For someone with dark skin, the camera will want to overexpose that skin, so you want to actually bring it back down by underexposing by about, again, -2/3 of a stop or 0.7 of a stop. Another kind of lighting that you can use is separation lighting, where you use lights, usually a light to separate the non-lit part of the person from the background. So in this case, in the model on the left-hand side there, the main lighting a face up is coming from an outdoor type battery-powered flash unit, shot through a very large softbox for that nice soft lighting. And then the light that's separating her from the background is the sun coming from the back there. And a picture of the black and white picture of the boy, the main light that's lighting him is coming from a window to our left, lighting him up. And then the bit of light from the right-hand side that's just separating him, you can see a little bit of light on his on the shoulder. That's to our right. That's coming from a reflector that's held very close to his back. So the light that's coming in from the window reflects off the reflector and just creates a little bit of a light fall on his shoulder to bring that out a little bit. The other tool of the trade, apart from light, is depth of field. So depth of field is a storytelling device because what it does is it actually establishes a relationship or lack of relationship between the subject and the background. And so when you're thinking about depth of field, you've got to ask, does the background have a role to play in the storytelling process? How important is it for the viewer to be able to see the background? So here are two examples. In the first one, the background's just fluff. So this is shot at an extremely shallow depth of field, so the background's just there to not even provide anything, maybe just a little bit of structure, and that's about it. In the second one, we are basically saying that the background here shows context. It's environmental portrait, maybe. Maybe this guy is a Fremantle. This is shot in Fremantle. Maybe this guy's a Fremantle type dude, or he lives there or something like that, and it kind of relates the location to that person. Now, you would shoot with a very, very shallow depth of field. This is why people buy those 85mm f1.2L lenses and all that, in order to throw the background off focus so that the attention is basically directed solely at the person who is staring at the viewer, okay, the portrait subject. You can use that if you find that the backgrounds are distracting. So when I was in Bali and we visited this home, it was one of those random walking in a village, let's visit a home type scenario. And amazing when you have very receptive, friendly people that you can visit randomly, open to actually showing you their homes and meeting their grandmother and stuff like that. Is the background's really messy. It's a kitchen and it's got a lot of implements in the back. So shooting this, basically make it a portrait of this very interesting woman who's got a beanie on her head and traditional kind of Balinese clothing and a scarf and all that on. Makes it important to blur the background, for example. If the background sets the scene, then show a little bit more of it. Some texture, some detail, but maybe not so much. So you can tell that this is completely post fashion-y type shoot, but she's in the park with a bit of water coming down, a little fake waterfall there. But you can also be experimental with depth of field. Portraits aren't always about shallow depths of field. They can also be about very deep depths of field. So the picture on the left-hand side is a boatman in Varanasi. It's shot at about f2, 35mm, which is enough to make him nice and sharp in the background to be in soft focus, but also tell us that there are boats and old-looking buildings in the background to give the fact that this is taken in Varanasi. The one on the right-hand side, I think, was shot about f10 in Fremantle. And that's just purely to make the cranes and the warehouses and all that at the back just as sharp, because it was a kind of look about the sharpness, about the shapes of the figures against the white walls. You know, in this scenario here, taken at a pub in Tasmania, again, it was just the light coming through that was so beautiful on whoever was sitting on the other side of the bar, but also the old world wood panel at the back there with the frame posters up there. So the depth of field needed to include, those posters to give it context. If you do shoot very, very shallow depths of field, then focusing on the eyes are critical. So what I try to do basically is I try to get them posed in such a way that both eyes are on the same plane as the camera axis, so that at least both eyes are sharp in that regard. If you use a mirrorless camera these days, most of them, if not all of them, now have eye detect. So use them. Use the eye detect when you're shooting for very shallow depths of field, because that means that you're never going to not focus on the eyes. But if you don't have a mirrorless camera, or you don't have a camera which has eye detect on it, then you're going to basically select the focus point closest to where you want to put the eye in your composition and use that to focus on the eye, because you don't want your recomposition, when you focus and you recompose, you don't want that recomposition to change the distance between the camera and the eye, because that could throw it slowly out of focus. So always choose the focus points. Work out how you want to compose it, work out where the eyes are going to be, and choose the focus point that is closest to the eye to focus on that eye itself. So here are some tips there. Just only very minimal camera movement when you're repositioning. This is not an issue. If you're using a mirrorless camera with eye detect, you can basically just compose and let the camera focus on the eye. That's all easy to do that. And just make sure you're absolutely still when you take the shot. Don't lean forward, don't lean backwards, because you're shooting at very, very shallow depths of field. And what I often do is I press the shutter button after I have exhaled. Okay, framing. How do you frame a portrait? What do you leave in? What do you leave out? Framing determines how we as viewers engage with the person in the picture, and more importantly, their world as well. So you choose your lens focal length and how far away is subject in order to get the framing that you want. Well, here are some examples. You've got your tight and very close framing, where really it's just the face and not even the entire face. Sometimes it's just, kind of like cropped right into the face itself is filling the frame. And so all attention is drawn to the eyes. You make sure the eyes are sharp and everything else behind is non-distracting, shallow depth of field. It's about the light in the eyes. And quite often what I like to do is also introduce a catch light into the eyes. So I position them so that their eyes are reflecting a bit of the light source coming through. For those of you who have seen the 2012 film version of Les Miserables, there's a very poignant section where Anne Hathaway, who plays, I can't remember her name now, but anyway, it's the mother of Cosette. She's obviously lost her job, has no prospects, has to sell her teeth, cut her hair off and sell her hair, etc., etc. So she's down in the dumps and she's singing her heart out about how difficult life is and how, the dream that she dreamt that she would live a wonderful life has, gone completely bonkers. And you can see here the way in which it's the framing is just entirely on her face. We don't even see the top of her head. We don't even see what's below her neck, so to speak, because it's really all about the raw emotion that's coming through. And because this is, for a cinema screen, it's obviously kind of like longer than it is tall. But all that negative space on the left basically just forces us to engage with the emotion on the right-hand side, which I thought was a very, very clear and powerful composition device, using negative space to push our gaze towards the right-hand side where the emotional action is taking place. So you got your close framing. And again, it's all about interaction, engaging with the person. Then you got a bit of a looser framing where the background can add some context to the thing. But the important thing, the focus is still away of the face, is still on the face. When you're shooting like this, you've got to be quite aware that you don't introduce distracting elements in the background, such as trees that seem to sprout out of someone's head or a fence paling that seems to go in one ear and out the other. So move around the person you're photographing and try to keep the background behind your head, at the very least, as clean as possible. Then you get the environmental portrait, where the setting is important and they're shown within the context of the setting. So you can use a wider angle focal length or shoot from further away to achieve that particular effect. So here's an example of a young Yolngu man up in Bawaka in East Annam Land. And obviously here is the guy who's vibing a rural character. The environmental portraits, they're just quite different. Back at Tukatunda in Bali. So a lot of the time when I do my portraits, it seems to be very kind of landscape orientation, the horizontal orientation. But I want to talk a little bit about vertical framing as well. Because vertical framing is good because we tend to look at horizontal compositions from left to right, so we can make use of negative space and all that. And in vertical framing, we either go top to bottom or bottom to top. So it's an interesting way of actually playing around with where you put the person in a vertical frame and how you basically organize the composition around that frame. In both of this, it's kind of about having their faces at the top and not much happening at the bottom, so that our attention kind of comes from their faces, comes down to see where they're at, and moves back up to their faces again. When you're framing and background, you can basically work out how much background you need to actually show in the image. So this picture was taken in Bali again. It's shot at 35mm wide angle, quite close to the subject. to incorporate the background elements to add to the context of the story. A little bit of an environmental portrait over here. Also shot at 35 millimeters here, getting quite close though, so I can actually get a emphasis on the face, and shooting at f2.8 because the background is really distracting. So I just wanted enough of it to give a context of where it's at, but the focus here is still on the person. Same thing here. Background provides context, shot at wide aperture to prevent it from getting too distracting. And in the case of a background that has got no relevance at all, then stand back, zoom in, use the background as blurry wallpaper, basically. Shooting distance is important as well. So here's the same guy again. The first one is shot at 25 millimeters, so I had to be very, very close. And you can see straight away that his forehead is very pronounced in the picture. And there is a level of distortion in the way his face is presented. And also then a strange kind of perspective distortion when we look down at his torso as well. So his head looks super large, and it presents that kind of a kind of unreal kind of an effect that can create a particular feeling or a particular mood. Whereas in the second picture, it's shot at 75 mil, so I've stepped all the way back, zoomed in a bit more, and you can see that the orientation and the way his face looks is quite different. So by stepping back and zooming in, you almost present the way they look like normally when you're actually looking at someone within, normal speaking distance. Whereas if you want to go for something quite funky and something quite distorted, shoot wide angle, get really close. Tell them you're going to get close though, otherwise they might overreact to you kind of even bringing the camera lens within inches of your face. Tell them you're going to get close, and you get quite an interesting kind of effect coming through there. In terms of composition, what I normally do is I always make sure that the way in which the person presents themselves in the image, the way I use lines and all that in the background, it's all about bringing the viewer's gaze back to the person's eyes. So in this case, there's a triangular pose that takes our attention to the eyes of this lady here, to the eyes of this dancer here as well. And again, to the eyes of this very close-up crop of this man here, working with diagonals that way. And again, kind of providing another triangle to take the attention back to the eyes there. And then when I shoot very close-up images, my two things is I leave enough space between the forehead and the top of the frame, and I leave enough space between the frame and the chin or the jaw, unless I'm going for something like super duper close-up. If someone's looking in one particular direction, I give them space to look into, which is just a very common compositional guideline. And then here are some examples back from Dorothea Lange. Yusuf Karsh with his portrait of Winston Churchill. He only had 30 seconds to take this portrait back in the days. And Annie Leibovitz. And then we're looking at posing. So with the pose, we're establishing the relationship between the portrait sitter and the viewer. And the viewer basically is you, the photographer, because where you stand in relation to the person's eyes affects how the viewer is going to react to that person in the portrait that you create. So you're looking at eye level, you're looking at their body language, you're looking at what they're doing with their hands as well. Hands is a really kind of sticky point for a lot of portrait photographers because you need to do something with hands. So let's look at the angle first. The first one is at eye level. The second one is slightly above eye level. And for me, the second one immediately sets up a closer engagement between the viewer and the subject than the first one. And the reason is this. In the first image, the viewer and the subject are looking at each other as equals. And while we might look at each other as equals, it simply means that no one is feeling superior or more powerful than the other. But when you're creating a portrait of someone, then part and parcel of it is to actually create a vibe or a feeling. Are you trying to make the subject appear powerful, or are you trying to make the viewer appear powerful? So in this case, I moved the camera up just a little bit so that the person has to raise their eyes up a little bit more, look into the camera, and it looks as if they're looking up towards the viewer. So because the viewer now feels a little bit more powerful, the viewer might feel more engaged with the subject or the person I'm photographing. The tilt and angle of the face can convey a range of different emotions as well. So a lot of you who have got dogs know that sometimes when dogs are a bit curious and they don't know what's going on, they kind of tilt their head at a really strange angle. And the same thing happens with people. If I'm listening to you and I'm really interested in what you're saying, I will actually kind of tilt my head almost towards your direction a little bit. And you can mimic that to kind of create an engaging portrait, because then the viewer is fooled into thinking that the portrait subject is actually trying to listen to what they're saying. Now, it's not, because they're dealing with a two-dimensional, flat image. But it presents an emotion anyway. So quite often, just the way in which you pose the head, the tilt of it can change it. With hands, I think that people do remarkable things with their hands, and you can include them in the way in which you pose subjects in your portraits, because the hands can communicate emotion, they can enhance emotion, they can create a particular mood, they can suggest things like I'm being very thoughtful, or I'm being very pensive, like the picture on the left and the picture on the right-hand side. Here are more uses of hands there as well. Okay, so again, it's about strength and size when someone basically tucks their hands in and pushes their biceps out, or when you put your hand into your pockets and you stand that way. Straight away it says, "Don't come near me because I'm grumpy and old." If you want people to be very relaxed, get them to lean against something or put your hands around something, and then the whole body just relaxes. So get them to put your hands on the back of a chair, or lean up against a wall, or lean up against a window, and immediately the whole body just goes into this really kind of nice, slumpish, but not overly lazy kind of feel to it. The other thing I like doing when I'm kind of posing my subjects, basically to avoid the whole kind of looking flat straight into the camera and everything's just on the same plane, is to get them kind of angling their body slightly away from the camera, whether in one direction or the other, and then turning their head in the opposite direction. So what happens is this: they have to turn their head towards the light. They always have to look towards the light, which means that if you are using this particular technique, their body needs to be facing slightly away from the light. So here's another example. The body, this guy is looking towards our left, and his head is turning towards our right a little bit. Posing can be feminine. You can be very experimental with your posing. You have a masculine pose with a very feminine subject, for example. You can have confronting front-on poses that exude power, softer poses where hands are touching each other, fingers lightly on each other, ballet hands, stuff like that can be good at suggesting softness. So try and avoid overly complicated poses. I avoid over-directing people. Don't tell them, move your ear this way, don't tilt your head this way. I often, if I want them to move their head, I'll just basically say, use my fingers, and you can't see me because I'm just a voice, but I'll just tilt my fingers left, tilt my fingers right, and says, just turn your head this way, and I tilt my fingers, and then they'll just move it a little bit, because I can show them how much or how little I want them to move. Give more attention to faces and eyes and expressions and feelings and emotions, and try to match the pose with the story or the feeling you're trying to create. And the last bit I'm going to talk about, and we'll wrap up, is engagement. Engagement is important because you go from a level of uncertainty and someone being very, very conscious with the camera to the person being relaxed and very comfortable with the camera, because suddenly they're no longer engaging with the camera, they're engaging with you. So what you want to do basically is to make that shift. You want to get the person you're photographing to not connect with the camera, but to connect with you. Most people initially, when you've got a camera raised in front of them, will look at the camera, not the photographer, because your face is behind the camera, they can't see your face. So they'll engage with the camera, and then they'll have a level of hesitancy about them. So what you need to do is actually talk, engage, so that even though the camera's between you and them, they are no longer conscious of the camera. They're just basically looking and thinking purely about the person behind the camera, not the camera itself. So here are some communication engagement tips there. You have to communicate. You've got to engage, you direct, you position for the light, then you engage. Even if you're talking nonsense, you're engaging. Silence is not golden when you're a portrait photographer, because when you pause and you don't say anything, they don't know what's going to happen. They don't know whether they're doing something wrong. They don't know why you've stopped talking. So if you need to basically make a setting adjustment on your camera, you articulate that verbally. You say, All right, hang on a sec. Just hold that pose. It's beautiful, but I'm just going to make this thing here. I'm going to make this change here. I'm just going to move the light here. You stay there. It's good. You keep talking all the way through because your voice is what they're engaging with. So the moment you put the camera in front of your face, they're not connected to the camera. They're still connecting to your voice, which means that you need to take the opportunity to make as much eye contact as possible with the subject during the shoot itself. You focus on their eyes, you engage with their eyes, and you basically just continue shooting, and continue to engage even when you're shooting. And you always keep an eye on that buildup of emotion from that moment of uncertainty to the moment of connection, the moment of trust, and then you just shoot your 2 or 3 frames very quickly, and you'll get that moment, that key moment. Also get experimental or creative with your portrait photography. There's no reason why you can't try technical stuff like underexposing for the background and using flash lighting to bring out the subject and putting another flash in a little lantern and getting the subject to pretend that she's carrying a lit lantern at night. This is taken at 11 a.m. in the morning, but on a fairly stormy day. So by underexposing the background, I make it look as if it's twilight. This is just shooting water falling on this guy, but shooting with a very, very fast shutter speed with the lighting in order to freeze the motion of water. And Halloween portraits are very, very good to take photographs of because they are a lot of fun. And I'll finish off with the editing part of it, just to give you a few tips in terms of editing. So we talked a lot about drawing attention to eyes and faces and about removing distractions and all that. And this is where editing comes to the fore. You can use editing, your Lightrooms and your Photoshop and all that to draw attention to the faces and the eyes. Because the faces and the eyes should be the brightest part or highest contrast areas in the image. So the eyes or the viewer will always be drawn to bright things. You can clone and heal out distracting elements in the background. You can selectively darken areas of the frame because the eye doesn't want to naturally go to dark things. It wants to go to bright things. And then you can use color or lack of color to create mood and to prompt emotion. So here's a before and after shot. So here's a picture taken of Kieran, one of our models, at a shearing shade in Bailing Up. That was a shot with the light. You can see that because he's a very pale person who doesn't actually go into the sun a lot, even though he's pretending to be some farmer shearer guy, his shoulder is incredibly pale and much lighter than his face. And obviously light falls on other parts of the scene, and then you've got those holes in the corrugated iron shade that allows light to come through. So when I edit this in Lightroom, I basically remove those distractions in the editing process itself and do a bit of color toning and color tinting to get that. Okay, that's it. Thanks for listening. I think I did go for more than that hour. Hopefully no one got up and left while I was rambling on about portraiture and the fine art of portraiture. I forgot to stop for questions, but are there any questions at the moment?
Hi, Seng. Can you hear me, Seng? It's Ian.
Yes, I can hear you.
Oh, hey, thanks for that. I think we're just going to, everybody needs to absorb that before we do some questions. So I want to say thanks very much for that. It was absolutely fantastic, and a super special thank you to Diane. I think she's
I can see someone. I can see someone lovely waving over there. I'm not sure who that is,
the
but
cameras.
I'll wave back.
For me, that was a super successful evening. As we said earlier on, this is our first go at zooming somebody in as a presentation.
Oh, I see Diane.
I think it's done
Diane.
really
Hi,
well.
how you going? Hey.
And to hear all about portraiture that started with sort of concept and communication and all that sort of stuff. 2/3 of your presentation wasn't even anything about technical. It was all about why and how to talk to people, and I think that's really huge. And I really love that you circled right back to that at the end with some technical bits in the middle. So thanks very much. I think that was really fantastic. If you were here, we'd like to invite you through for a cup of tea. We'd show you some of the prints on the wall and just everybody would chew your ear and get a good chance to have a chat. But I'd much rather we were there in Fremantle and went out the door at, 6:30, 5:30, and went and had a beer instead of a cup of tea. So maybe we can chalk that up and do that next time. So just like to everybody to big round of applause for Seng and say thanks very much. Well done.
I might be heading Christchurch Way in about mid-April or around the 20th of April next year. So if you've got anything on at that point in time, I'd be happy to pop in and say hello.
that would be awesome. We'll take you up on that. I'm going to write it down in the diary, and we'll make sure that happens. So, thank you once again.
All right. Have a good night, folks. Hopefully I didn't go too long. I think it's about, what, 9:30-ish for you?
Something like that.
Something like that, yeah. About knock-off time for camera clubs, really, isn't it?
Okay, thanks very much.
No worries. I'll catch you guys later. Enjoy your night. See ya.
Bye.
Wow, that was pretty cool, eh? Did you all enjoy that? Did you learn something, do you think? Wow, far out. I don't even want to start trying to work out what. I think the main thing I learned is I'm never going to be a good portrait photographer because I really don't like talking to people. Other than you guys, of course, which is awesome. So anyway, can I just get you all to turn your phones off? And the emergency exits are either side of the stage. I will rush through the announcements. We have got quite a few. Alistair. We'll start with the print exhibition.
Just a quick one. Tonight's showing of her prints is Diana, who's been a member for, I don't know how long, but there we go, 22 years. So she's our great bird photographer, landscape photographer, and fungi expert, and tour guide for our fungi trips. So we really appreciate that. So if you'd like to talk to Diana after the show about her prints, oh yeah, okay. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. It's really nice seeing them. Just for those, I'm sure Diana will explain this if you're going to have a chat to her. The images on the end, the 10 prints on the end are Diana's licentiate set. So yeah, go and have a quick look while we have tea. Mike. Field trips.
Continuing the theme with Diana and fungi, next weekend, so not this weekend, next weekend is the fungi trip up at the Boyle River. We've got a good number of registrations coming through for that, but if you are still keen to register, there's still space. $75 for the 2 nights. And go and get some images like some of those lovely fungi prints up there. Mount Cook. Oh, of course, yeah. You're up to the Lewis Pass area, so you can go for a day trip if you want to, if you don't want to stay overnight, but perhaps just get in touch with Diana and let her know what you're doing so that we can help point you in the right direction. Mount Cook, if you're interested in booked accommodation at the motel for that, need those registrations by Sunday, please, so that I can get that booked in before the rates go up to accommodate the tourists that are about to arrive. So that's for the Mount Cook field trip at the end of July, the week after Laurie Thomas.
Cool, thank you, Mike. Sorry, I was supposed to come and stand over here for our AVs and broadcasting. CPS is really keen to get one or maybe 2 more volunteers to help out with the AV tech side of things. If anyone has any inclination to help out, the guys at the back would absolutely love to show you what they do and get a little bit of a hand. We do have basically 2 people doing it at the moment, and it takes 2 people to 3 to do these presentations. So unfortunately, that means none of them get a night off ever, and they'd love a bit of help if that's possible. If anyone has a bit of free time, please come and find out how to do a little bit of the sound and lighting or the YouTube streaming or whatever it takes. Go and have a chat to Gordon and Wayne or Andrew. We've got lots of magazines down the front from Rach. Everyone watching on YouTube, bad luck. Rach would absolutely love it if there were none left by the end of the evening, so come and take a few. Is that right, Rach? Yeah, please come and take a few, read them, pass them on, enjoy them. That would be great. That's most of that. Ron came up to me this evening. Welcome along again, Ron. To mention, he's just got some results back from a US international salon in Palm Springs where he got a gold medal for a photojournalism image. Same one? Oh. Do you care to tell us what it was? Okay. Oh, fantastic. Not that recently then? Has anyone else got any results from competitions? Not at the moment. Well, you might have soon. We've got several national competitions ending, or opening and closing in the next month and a bit. The Tauranga AV Salon opens on the 5th of May, which is tomorrow. There's a PSNZ salon associated with AVs and the Tauranga stuff as well. Do bear in mind that something I'm quite impressed with, PSNZ last year introduced a rule around not using copyrighted audio in AVs, which I think is a fantastic move because none of us are very happy when people steal our photographs. So I think that would be a great thing to start promoting, is using copyright-free audio. We have the Pukekohe Franklin Creative Focus competition. This is a digital comp that opens on the 3rd of June. And Laurie Thomas, who hopefully you've all heard of, is open right now, closes 22nd of May, hosted by our club, and with an excellent success rate within CPS. So hopefully we'll see some more great CPS landscape images in that. The next CPS competition that closes is Open Projected Image 5, Photojournalism, which closes June 15th, so you've got a little while on that one. And this month's MDC, we do not have a topic for yet, so we're going to pick a topic right now. John, can I invite you up, please? Hopefully the AV for last month's Seated will be shown next week. Sorry, we haven't managed to do that tonight. John.
Thank you, James. You can be our number chooser tonight. Apologies, COVID hit me 2 weeks ago and sort of everything got confused. But the AV for the Seated has been completed, and I thought it would have been shown here a couple of weeks ago, but it didn't happen. So it will be here next week, and we'll show it next week and present the chocolate fish. James, 1 to 7. 6. And James, 1 to 30. 22 comes at, teenager. Could be an interesting topic. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. Teenager, oh my. Good luck, everyone, for this month's competition. I'm not sure what I'm going to do with that. We did have an excellent mat cutting tutorial with John C. Smith and Mike and Jane and Paul at 7 o'clock. We were intending to have time for people to play with the mat cutters, but I think we're a bit out of time. So wander through, go and have a cup of tea. John and John. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm working off the website. So, yeah. 13th of May? 18th of May. Okay, that's a little bit sooner. And JT? Okay, there we go. Drop your AVs to John this evening. So let's break for tea. Go and ask people questions about mat cutters, but you probably won't get a chance to use them. Thanks ever so much to John C. Smith for coming in for the tutorial. Thanks to Gordon and Wayne on sound and AV and lighting. Thanks to Ian on projection, and thank you. Andrew, and everyone else who's helping out. Thanks to Dennis for opening up. Sapa, JT? Alistair, excellent, thank you. Meet and greet JK and John Hunt. And I've briefly been your MC for just under 10 minutes. Thanks very much. Good night.